Welcome back to the panel discussion, Progress and Opportunity in Shared Services, sponsored by Deloitte here on federalnewsradio.com and Federal News Radio 1500 AM. Our guests today are David Mader, the Controller at the Office of Management and Budget. Beth Angerman is Executive Director of Unified Shared Services Management at the General Services Administration. Bill Beyer is a Principal at Deloitte Consulting. Thomas Muir is Director of Support Services at the Veterans Affairs Department. And Chip Fulghum, the Chief Financial Officer and Deputy Secretary for Management at the Homeland Security Department. And before the break, we were discussing the quality and breadth and organization of the supply base, principally federal agencies that are doing shared services now. And so, Beth, I want to start with you and ask, when you look at this in a unified way at GSA, do you look at, you said, the supply. What is the state of supply in the federal government, and do those big shared services providers, DFAS, Interior, Agriculture, get the resources they need to be world-class?
So the state of supply is that, shared services has grown up over time, and a lot of what we see today in terms of the marketplace are agencies who did something well and organically kind of just started doing those things for other agencies. And it really has just been a kind of an evolution of the current providers today. But to Dave's point, starting to look at this the way that agencies are looking at this, which is I'm not just going for finance solutions or for HR solutions, I'm starting to think about it from an overarching strategy perspective. We need to look at the kind of the approach to how the delivery is structured today and figure out if there really is the capacity to grow and expand, given our previous point about how much demand we see coming for this. Are we in an organizational arrangement today that gives us that capacity? Or do we need to address some of those challenges in a different way so that we truly do have an optimal delivery model for government?
So the implication is that maybe in some cases they're really good at it, in some cases they need some investment or beefing up.
Yep, and I think we see a variety of performance today. All of these providers, and I should say this, have all of the very best intentions, right? They do what they do well, and they are motivated to provide these services to other agencies so that they can focus on their missions, right? And I think that it would be remiss of us not to acknowledge that. But truth be told is that they do have the delivery model is embedded, right, in organizations whose mission isn't necessarily that, right, to deliver these services to others. And that's one of the challenges that we need to look at as we look at the long-term solution.
Yeah, and Dave, how does that whole picture look from the OMB standpoint? Because, their cat food is part of this also.
Right. I think, Tom, it's interesting. You need to go back in history, probably, to the late 80s, early 90s, when shared services started to develop, National Finance Center and others. And it basically grew up, as the panelists have talked about, financial management, HR, payroll, but there was never sort of a comprehensive enterprise look at how to deliver these core services. People could just opt in or opt out, right? There were no standards. There were no service level agreements. And what we've been doing as part of the CAP goal for shared services is taking that enterprise look and saying, how do I organize? How do I manage? How do I move the marketplace in a consistent way? Because what we don't want is one shared service provider to be high performing and another not meeting their customers' expectation. The goal of dealing with this as an enterprise now is we want everybody performing at the optimal level. The most efficient, most effective, the most satisfied customers. And we're going to have to manage very differently than if we managed by basically the stovepipes that exist today. Because as one of the panelists said, somebody is, located in Treasury, somebody's located in Interior, somebody's located in Transportation or in Interior, and that's their home agency. So as Chip had mentioned, there's a little bit of, sort of tug between the core mission of those departments and the delivery of services to customers who are not in their department. So what Beth and her organization are doing are putting in place the service level agreements, the reviews that we're going to need to start managing across this enterprise. And then we need to address the question about, is this the optimal organizational configuration for the future?
And Bill, do you think that the investment levels that happen at these federal agencies that are shared suppliers, shared services suppliers, match what you see in the private sector in terms of what is needed to keep a facility and an offering up to top standards?
Not even close. The issue right now is when you implement a shared service or you have a migrating agency coming to a provider, the provider has to build capability. These providers right now don't have the capability that they need in order to accept an agency. And then on the agency side, the agency has to pony up some money in order to do the migration, because basically you're having a duplicative kind of situation where you have to keep this function going until you can migrate it to, and it's just not a dead stop. You have to overlap just a bit. So typically, especially in the federal market right now, we're seeing it's not a cost savings, it's an efficiency savings over time. And so literally you don't see the ROI necessarily, but you do see a return on investment of some sort over 3 or 4 years after you do a migration. So the compelling platform of money is unique to the federal government, but we have not supported these providers, as Dave said and Beth. They grew up organically, so their funding mechanisms are not standardized, and so therefore they're not able to invest in sort of the latest technologies or train their people in the latest processes and those type of things. And the migrating agencies as well are constrained by that because they're not able to invest in the newest technologies. So we have sort of a catch-22, and there needs to be some release valve somewhere that allows them to become world-class providers.
And let's ask those two migrating agencies. We'll start with Tom at VA. When you jump down onto a trampoline, you want to know that that trampoline bed won't tear and you'll go crashing to the ground below. Right. What do you look for signs of assurance that your shared services provider will, in fact, support VA in the way that you hope it will or need it to?
Part of that journey, and our journey is much like most agencies' journeys, and I think we're challenged in VA being so large that there are very few providers that can take this scale. But provides huge opportunity because you've got great economies in scale when you do make the migration. But with 370,000 employees, it's very difficult for an agency to take on VA as an HR client, for example. There's just not that capacity either in the public sector or the private sector. So part of our journey is we're looking at consolidating some of that work internally and reducing some of those duplicative efforts so we can push the mission support to the hospitals, to our clinics, to our VBA regional offices, and to our national cemeteries so we can serve veterans better. So ours is focused on a veteran-centric look at our business enterprises. And then we think once we consolidate, eliminate duplication, standardize processes, as Dave mentioned earlier, standardized service level agreements that meet the customer's expectations and then measure the performance rigorously against that process, that then kind of ensures this discussion between the customer and the provider. And then when the marketplace expands a little, and we're working through Beth's office at GSA, when the marketplace expands and has capacity, then I think it's going to be ready for some of VA's capabilities to be met in the federal marketplace.
Because a service level agreement and even monitoring after you establish it, that doesn't ensure anything unless the actual capacity is there, correct?
Right. There has to be accountability on both the provider and the customer, right? And it's accountability on both sides. You have to be a good customer and you have to have a great provider. The challenge, of course, is how do you measure that against your own agency's performance? Because when you take on another agency, you're essentially taking on additional work, right? And do you have the capacity to do that work to those standards is always a challenge.
And Chip, how do you look at it?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things. One, everybody's talking about capacity. That's a big challenge. Going from small agencies to an agency of our size, clearly you got to have the ability to scale and you need capacity. And I think we've seen that without investment coming from somewhere, in this case, it's coming from our department. We are investing in that. You can't get there. Someone has to put the dollars on the table, and we're doing that. Once you do that, and you get some capacity, then I think you do get some efficiencies. But those efficiencies are always down the road, and everybody is looking at today. No one is looking at 4 or 5 years from now, when there will be that savings, that efficiency that you get, because rather than changing the system 9 times for 9 different customers, you're going to change it 1 time. That also requires some give on the customer side. We're used to very customized solutions that meet our unique needs. and rather than more standardized business processes like Tom was talking about. So you've got to have that as well, right? You've got to have a little bend in the customer to a more standardized approach. But I think the biggest thing is we need capacity, and the providers have to be able to scale up. And we also can't forget why we did this to start with. While there's an efficiency to be gained, there was an operational imperative for us, which was we had legacy financial management systems that were in desperate need of modernizing. And this is the absolute right thing to do, but it has to be done in a way where there's the capacity and there's the scalability to go to it.
All right, and Dave, in the private sector, if you're a cloud provider or whatever you are, whatever your business is, you decide what your future requirements will be for capacity, and you take some of your retained earnings, and that's part of your investment strategy.
Right.
Federal agencies operate under the Economy Act. They can't get a profit except for just enough left over to pay their people and turn the lights on. So how can agencies, these providers that we mentioned, Treasury, Interior, Agriculture, DFAS, get what they need to invest in shared services capacity if they can't retain, so to speak, earnings?
And I think, Tom, that going forward, that's our biggest challenge. Again, as we think about how shared services grew up over 30 years or so, they grew up as organizations that were servicing their home agency, right? And now we're actually changed the business model, and we believe we need to change the financing model. And I think the President's 17 budget with the IT Modernization Fund actually starts to change the dynamic, because in the case of the President's proposal, let's say Beth and I and the folks in USSM say we need we need to increase our supply to meet the demand. So we need, X capacity for financial systems. We can put together a business case and bring it to that investment board and ask them to, sort of make the investment. That'll give us the capital to build the new systems, to provide the kind of capacity that the demand is out there. The problem, and I think we've all touched on it, is we now have more demand than we have supply, and we have got to fix that problem. And I think the only way we're going to fix it is by providing an investment fund to build that capacity over the next several years.
Now, that investment fund is really more like a revolving fund. That
It
is
has to
say
be paid back.
It has to be
Right.
paid back.
Right.
And so it gets paid back through future efficiencies, I guess.
Right,
So,
which Chip has touched on and which Bill has touched on.
but future efficiencies of the customer agencies or of the shared services provider?
Both.
Right, so that's a pretty complicated mechanism for ensuring that happens, though.
I don't think it's that complicated. I think it's pretty straightforward. It's basically if I'm going to bring a business proposition to you and it's going to show an ROI over X number of years, I make that investment and then I pay that back. I think it's pretty straightforward.
Okay, and overlaid on that, though, there has to be the actual quality of services to support the SLAs, and not just. I mean, you could have a return on investment, but still not be able to be
Right.
world class in terms of what a
Right,
big agency
which was
needs
Chip's
moving
point
in.
is,
Right.
it's not like we're going to have people provide an unsatisfactory level of service. And that's why, one of the initiatives that Beth has undertaken in their first year is creating the service level agreements and providing the customer satisfaction. So we're going to know next year, for, HR, finance, IT, acquisition, what is the relative cost to do that business? And then what is the absolute customer satisfaction level against that cost?
And we've been talking as if it's got to be only the government providing these services. And I think a big question for many years from the supply community, from the commercial contractor community, is what is our place in shared services? And we'll ask Beth and then Bill, what is industry's part in all this when you do have a capacity shortfall?
So I don't think that we could do this without industry, right? I don't think it's a black and white world anymore where you either go to industry or you go to a federal provider, because every federal provider today is in one or many partnerships with an industry, with some company from industry, right? Whether it's through the software that they provide or through services that they provide to be able to expand and contract as needed. I think what we're trying to do is accentuate everyone's strengths in this model, which is making sure that we truly set up a shared environment with all of the guiding principles that Chip talked about, right? Standard solutions, standard processes, as minimal customization as possible, right? but that also highlights the ability that industry can bring to the table, which is around the best technologies, the best hosting options, the ability to do good integration and implementation and project management support and data cleansing, and those types of services that are really required to make the migration to shared services successful, and then to also continue to have an operating environment that looks to the best technologies to improve the delivery.
It's almost as if the cloud effort could be a model for other
Yes,
shared services.
absolutely.
All right, we're going to get to Bill, but first we have to take a short break. Our guests today are Chip Fulghum, Chief Financial Officer and Deputy Secretary for Management at Homeland Security. Beth Angerman is Executive Director of Unified Shared Services Management at the General Services Administration. Dave Mader is Controller at the Office of Management and Budget. Thomas Muir is Director of Support Services at the Veterans Affairs Department. And Bill Byer is a Principal at Deloitte Consulting. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. This is Progress and Opportunities in Federal Shared Services, sponsored by Deloitte, here on federalnewsradio.com and Federal News Radio 1500 AM.